Eleanor's world narrowed to the impossible reality of those ancient eyes staring into hers. Every instinct screamed at her to recoil, to scramble away from the pale hands extended toward her hiding place, but her body remained frozen beneath the mahogany table. This was madness, first fleeing through London's treacherous streets in nothing but her torn wedding gown, and now hallucinating strangers in the manor that had stood empty since her grandmother's death 3 years ago. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm raging outside. "I don't understand what you want. I just need somewhere safe." "Safety." The man called Lucian spoke the word as if tasting something bittersweet. "How long has it been since you truly felt safe, Eleanor?" The use of her name sent ice through her veins. She pressed herself harder against the marble floor, feeling the cold seep through her torn skirts. "How do you know who I am?" Above them, her husband's footsteps thundered across the floorboards, accompanied by the crash of furniture being overturned. "Eleanor!" Richard's voice carried that particular edge she knew meant his patience had expired. "Come out, my dear wife. You've caused quite enough trouble for one evening." Lucian's expression darkened, and for a moment Eleanor glimpsed something predatory flash across his aristocratic features. "He will not find you here," he said with quiet certainty. "The shadows of Ravenscroft have always protected your bloodline." "My bloodline?" Eleanor's mind raced, cataloguing fragments of her grandmother's stories, tales she dismissed as the fanciful ramblings of an eccentric old woman. Stories of guardians who walked in darkness, of pacts made in moonlight, of women in their family who possessed gifts that attracted both protection and peril. Grandmother used to speak of such things, but they were just stories, fairy tales. Were they? Lucian shifted, and Eleanor caught a glimpse of his full form, tall and elegant, dressed in clothing that seemed to belong to another century. His dark hair fell in waves that framed a face too perfect to be entirely human. "Your grandmother was a remarkable woman. She understood the delicate balance between our worlds." The footsteps above suddenly stopped. In the silence that followed, Eleanor's heart hammered so loudly she was certain it would give away her location. She had spent 6 months learning to read Richard's moods by the rhythm of his steps, the weight of his presence in a room. This silence was worse than his shouting. It meant he was thinking, planning, becoming methodical in his search. "Tell me," Lucian continued, his voice a whisper that somehow carried more weight than Richard's bellowing, "what finally gave you the courage to run? Was it when he struck you, when he threatened your precious books, or was it something else entirely?" Eleanor's hand moved instinctively to her throat, where bruises from Richard's fingers were already blooming purple beneath her skin. The memory of tonight's violence made bile rise in her throat. But it hadn't been the physical assault that broke her. It had been Richard's calm explanation of what he planned to do next, the clinical way he'd described how accidents befell disobedient wives. He was going to... She couldn't finish the sentence. Even here, hiding beneath furniture like a terrified child, the words wouldn't come. "Yes," Lucian said simply. "We know what he intended. We've been watching, waiting for you to choose flight over surrender. Your grandmother made us promise never to interfere unless you asked for help or unless..." A tremendous crash echoed from the floor above, followed by Richard's frustrated roar. "I know you're here, Eleanor. Your footprints lead right to this god-forsaken ruin. There's nowhere left to run." Eleanor flinched at the sound, but Lucian remained perfectly still. "He cannot see in true darkness as we can," he murmured. "Nor can he sense what this house remembers. To him these rooms are empty, but Ravenscroft Manor knows its own, and you, dear Eleanor, belong here more than you realize. I don't understand any of this." Tears burned her eyes as the weight of the night finally crashed over her. "Yesterday I was simply a librarian who spent her days cataloguing manuscripts about medieval agriculture and Anglo-Saxon poetry. I had a quiet life, even if it was..." She swallowed hard. "Even if it was becoming unbearable. Now I'm hiding in a manor that's supposedly empty, speaking to a man who claims to know my dead grandmother, while my husband hunts me like some kind of animal." Lucian's expression softened, and for a moment he looked almost human. Your quiet life was an illusion, carefully constructed to keep you safe until you were ready. But illusions can only last so long. He extended his hand again, palm upward. I offer you truth, Eleanor Blackthorne, though I warn you, once you take my hand, once you step fully into Ravenscroft's shadows, there will be no returning to the woman you were. Above them, Richard's footsteps resumed, moving with deadly purpose toward the dining room where they hid. Eleanor stared at Lucian's outstretched hand, knowing that everything, her future, her sanity, perhaps her very soul, hung in the balance of her next choice. The pale hand remained outstretched before her, elegant fingers steady despite the chaos thundering overhead. Eleanor's mind reeled backward, grasping desperately for the normalcy that had defined her existence just hours before. Yesterday morning, she had awakened in the suffocating opulence of Richard's Belgravia townhouse, the same as every morning for the past 18 months of their marriage. The routine had been her armor, predictable, controllable, safe in its very mundanity. She would rise at dawn, careful not to disturb Richard's sleep, and slip down to the kitchen where Mrs. Hartwell would already have her tea prepared. The housekeeper's knowing glances at Eleanor's increasingly frequent bruises had become part of that routine too, a silent acknowledgement that neither woman dared voice. Then the familiar walk through London's grey streets to the Royal Historical Society, where her position as assistant curator of medieval manuscripts provided blessed sanctuary. Those manuscript rooms had been her refuge. Surrounded by centuries-old vellum and carefully preserved illuminations, Eleanor could lose herself in the methodical work of cataloguing, translating, preserving. Her photographic memory made her invaluable to Professor Whitmore, who relied on her ability to cross-reference obscure Latin texts and identify patterns across disparate historical documents. She had friends there, gentle scholars like Miss Catherine Fairfax, who brought her novels to borrow, and old Mr. Pemberton, who shared his expertise on paleography while sneaking her sweets from his personal tin. Your talents are wasted on dusty old books, Richard had begun saying with increasing frequency. A wife's duty lies in supporting her husband's career, not indulging in these scholarly fantasies. The criticism had grown sharper each month, coinciding with Richard's rising prominence in legal circles. As his success expanded, so did his expectations of the perfect society wife. Eleanor's independence, once charming during their brief courtship, had become an embarrassment to be corrected. The late evenings at the library became arguments. Her passion for ancient languages became unseemly obsession. Her desire to contribute original research to historical journals became inappropriate ambition. She had tried to compromise, reducing her hours, declining opportunities to collaborate with visiting scholars from Oxford and Cambridge. But each concession only fed Richard's growing need to control every aspect of her existence. He monitored her correspondence, questioned her whereabouts, and gradually isolated her from any relationship that might remind her of who she had been before becoming Mrs. Richard Pembroke. The worst part was how easily she had let it happen. Eleanor Blackthorne, who could read Latin treatises as fluently as modern English, who had once corrected a Cambridge professor's translation of a particularly challenging passage from Beowulf, had somehow become a woman who apologized for speaking too much at dinner parties and hid her books beneath the bed like shameful secrets. Above them, Richard's voice cut through the storm with terrifying clarity. I know you're frightened, darling, but this is madness. You'll catch your death wandering about in this weather. Come home, and we'll forget this entire unfortunate episode. The false tenderness in his tone made Eleanor's stomach clench. She knew that voice. It was the same one he used after his worst rages, when remorse temporarily overcame his fury. But tonight had been different. Tonight there had been no rage at all, only cold calculation as he explained how her recent instability might necessitate confinement for her own protection, how accidents befell women who couldn't control their hysterics, how her inheritance from Grandmother Blackthorne would naturally pass to her devoted husband should anything tragic occur. Your grandmother visited you often at the library, Lucian observed softly, his ancient eyes seeming to read her thoughts. Even after your marriage, when Richard began restricting your other relationships. Eleanor's breath caught. It was true. Grandmother Blackthorne had appeared regularly during her final year, always with some excuse about researching family genealogy or verifying historical details for her own correspondence. But now, Eleanor remembered other things, how her grandmother's visits coincided with Eleanor's darkest periods, how the old woman always seemed to know exactly when Richard's control tightened another notch. "She tried to warn me," Eleanor whispered, the realization striking like lightning. All those stories about family history, about women who had to make impossible choices. She wasn't just sharing folklore, she was preparing me. The footsteps above grew closer, accompanied by the systematic opening and closing of doors. Richard was being methodical now, checking every room with the thoroughness of a man accustomed to winning through patience and persistence. Lucian's hand remained steady, waiting. "Your quiet life gave you knowledge, Eleanor. Languages, history, research skills, all tools you'll need for what's coming. But that life also taught you to diminish yourself, to accept less than you deserved. The question now is whether you're ready to reclaim what was always yours." Eleanor stared at those pale fingers, thinking of her small desk at the Historical Society, her modest salary, her carefully curated existence among books and manuscripts. Such a small life, really, but it had been hers, the only thing that had ever truly belonged to her. Richard's footsteps approached the dining room. The dining room door creaked open. Eleanor's breath froze in her lungs as Richard's polished boots appeared in the doorway, illuminated by the flickering candlelight he carried. The flame cast dancing shadows across the dusty floorboards, and she pressed herself deeper into the darkness beneath the table, her torn wedding gown catching on the ornate chair legs. "How curious," Richard murmured, his voice carrying that dangerous note of discovery. Fresh footprints in the dust. Still warm candles. His boots moved closer, each step deliberate. The servants claimed this place has been abandoned for years, yet someone has been here recently. Someone who knows exactly which rooms to light. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched those familiar boots circle the room's perimeter. She had polished them herself countless times, part of the domestic submission Richard demanded from his wife. Now they seemed like instruments of predation, hunting her across the manor's ancient stones. "I can smell your fear, darling," Richard continued conversationally. "That particular scent you carry when you've been foolish, rather like roses left too long in stagnant water, sweet corruption." Lucian's presence beside her shifted, and though Eleanor couldn't see his expression in the shadows, she felt the temperature drop several degrees. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, yet it somehow carried absolute authority. "He is not what he appears to be." "What do you mean?" Eleanor breathed, but even as she asked, fragments of strangeness began assembling in her memory. Richard's unusual strength during his rages, strength that seemed far beyond what his lean frame should possess. The way servants quit without explanation after working late in the house. How he never seemed to age despite claiming to be 35, when she'd once found documents suggesting he'd been practicing law for nearly 2 decades. Above them, Richard laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Do you know what I find most amusing about this Gothic little tableau? My dear wife, hiding in her grandmother's rotting manor like some heroine from a penny dreadful. But what she doesn't realize is that I've been here before, many times." Eleanor's blood turned to ice. That was impossible. Richard had claimed never to have met Grandmother Blackthorne, had insisted the old woman's dislike of him stemmed from class prejudice and feminine hysteria. Her grandmother and I had such fascinating conversations about bloodlines and inheritances, Richard continued, his voice growing closer. About the responsibilities that come with certain gifts. The poor old woman thought she could hide you away among your books and manuscripts, could delay the inevitable by teaching you languages and filling your head with scholarly nonsense, but she was only postponing the harvest. Lucian's hand found Eleanor's wrist in the darkness, his touch impossibly cold yet somehow steadying. "Now you understand why we could not intervene," he whispered. The enemy has been beside you all along, wearing a husband's mask. Enemy? Eleanor's mind reeled, trying to process the impossible. Her husband, cruel, controlling but undeniably human, was something else entirely. What is he? Something that feeds on women like you, Lucian replied, his ancient eyes fixed on the boots that continued their methodical search. Something drawn to bloodlines with power. He courts, he marries, he consumes. Then he moves on to the next generation. The candlelight suddenly shifted, and Eleanor realized with growing horror that Richard was kneeling down, bringing the flame lower. In seconds he would see beneath the table. "I know you're here, Eleanor," he said, his voice now honey-sweet with false affection. "And I know you're not alone. That's rather exciting, actually. It's been some time since I've had to deal with interference in my domestic arrangements." Lucian rose to his feet in one fluid motion, stepping out from beneath the table into the flickering candlelight. Eleanor bit back a gasp. He seemed to shimmer, as if the shadows themselves bent to accommodate his presence. When Richard straightened to face him, the two men stood in stark contrast, Richard with his conventional handsomeness and predatory smile, Lucian with his otherworldly elegance and eyes like midnight storms. "Richard Pembroke," Lucian said, his voice carrying centuries of authority. "Though I suspect that's not your true name, is it? You reek of sulphur and borrowed flesh." Richard's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed sharper than Eleanor remembered. "Lord Ashford, how terribly inconvenient to find you here. I thought the old woman's death had severed your family's protection arrangements." "Did you?" Lucian stepped closer, and Eleanor noticed that Richard, who had never shown fear in her presence, took an involuntary step backward. "Then you understand very little about the pacts that bind our kinds." From her hiding place, Eleanor watched this confrontation between supernatural forces and realized her ordinary world had just shattered completely. The man she'd married, feared, and fled from was some kind of monster. The stranger who offered protection claimed to be a vampire king, and somehow, impossibly, she stood at the center of an ancient conflict she didn't understand. Everything she thought she knew was a lie. The only question now was which truth she was brave enough to embrace. The two supernatural beings faced each other in the candlelit dining room, their otherworldly confrontation unfolding above Eleanor, like something from her grandmother's darkest fairy tales. Yet she remained frozen beneath the table, paralyzed by the enormity of what she was witnessing. Her scholarly mind, trained to categorize, analyze, and preserve, reeled against truths that belonged in medieval bestiaries rather than her carefully ordered existence. "This cannot be real," she thought desperately. "I've suffered some kind of breakdown. The stress of Richard's violence has finally shattered my sanity." It would be easier to believe herself mad than to accept that her husband was a creature that wore human flesh like an ill-fitting coat, or that her salvation lay in the hands of a man who claimed to rule over vampires. Eleanor pressed her palms against her temples, willing herself to wake from this nightmare and find herself back in the familiar confines of the historical society, surrounded by comprehensible manuscripts about grain harvests and monastery records. "She's having difficulty accepting the evidence of her own senses," Lucian observed, without taking his eyes off Richard. 18 months of gaslighting will do that to a brilliant mind." Richard chuckled, the sound raising goosebumps along Eleanor's arms. "Brilliant? My dear wife's intellect extends to dead languages and dusty parchments, hardly practical skills for the modern world. I've been doing her a kindness, really, teaching her more domestic applications for her talents." The casual cruelty in his voice, so familiar, yet now layered with implications far more sinister than simple martial tyranny, sent ice through Eleanor's veins. How many times had she apologized for her scholarly obsessions? How many hours had she spent convincing herself that Richard's restrictions were reasonable, that a wife should prioritize her husband's comfort over her own ambitions? The old woman filled her head with nonsense about family legacies and hidden strengths, Richard continued, circling Lucian like a predator testing its prey. But look at her now. cowering under furniture like a mouse. Hardly the prophesied key to anything, wouldn't you say? Prophesied key? Eleanor's mind latched onto the phrase with scholarly precision, even as her heart hammered with terror. In her grandmother's stories, there had always been chosen ones, women who stood at crucial junctures between light and darkness. But those were metaphors, weren't they? Symbolic representations of moral choice rather than literal supernatural destiny. She has good reason to fear, Lucian replied coolly. You've spent months conditioning her to doubt her own judgment, to accept your version of reality over the evidence of her senses. But conditioning can be broken, and some bloodlines carry memories that run deeper than personal trauma. Eleanor's hands trembled as she remembered her grandmother's final visit to the library, just weeks before her death. The old woman had pressed an ornate brass key into Eleanor's palm, speaking urgently about Ravenscroft Manor and the importance of trusting her instincts when the time came to choose. You're stronger than you know, dear one, Grandmother Blackthorn had whispered. But strength unused atrophies like muscle. When the darkness reveals itself, you must decide whether to embrace what you truly are or remain safe in the cage of what others expect. At the time, Eleanor had assumed her grandmother was speaking in generalities about women's independence. Now, as supernatural forces argued over her fate mere feet above her hiding place, those words carried far more ominous weight. What if her grandmother had been warning her about this exact moment? What if the research skills, the linguistic knowledge, the careful cultivation of Eleanor's intellectual independence had all been preparation for something far more significant than cataloguing medieval manuscripts? But the alternative, accepting that she was somehow central to an ancient supernatural conflict, required abandoning every rational foundation upon which she'd built her identity. Eleanor Blackthorn was a quiet scholar who preferred books to people, theory to action. She catalogued other people's adventures rather than living her own. How could someone so fundamentally ordinary be important enough to warrant the attention of vampire kings and whatever Richard truly was? The choice remains hers, Lucian said, his voice carrying absolute finality. Whatever you are, whatever you've done, you cannot force what must be freely given. Can't I? Richard's smile revealed those two sharp teeth again. I've been conditioning her responses for over a year. She's learned to obey through pain, to doubt her judgment through careful manipulation. Watch. He turned toward Eleanor's hiding place, his voice dropping to the tender tone that always preceded his worst cruelties. Eleanor, darling, come out now. This gentleman is filling your head with impossible stories to take advantage of your distressed state. You know I would never hurt you without cause. You know you can trust me to protect you from your own poor judgment. The familiar pattern of his manipulation washed over her, the false kindness, the subtle blame, the implication that her fear was irrational and her independence dangerous. For 18 months, those words had worked like a key turning in a lock, opening doors to submission and self-doubt. But now, hearing Richard's voice layered with inhuman mockery, while Lucian stood ready to offer truths she wasn't certain she possessed the courage to embrace, Eleanor faced a terrible choice: remain the frightened mouse he'd trained her to be, or trust that her grandmother had seen something in her worthy of supernatural attention. The candlelight flickered, and both men waited for her decision. Eleanor's hands pressed flat against the dusty floorboards beneath the table, her torn wedding gown a mockery of the vows that had bound her to a monster. The weight of both men's expectations settled over her like a shroud, and for a heartbeat she remained paralyzed between two impossible choices: the familiar hell of Richard's manipulation or the unknown terror of Lucian's supernatural world. But then her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, clear as cathedral bells. When the darkness reveals itself, you must decide whether to embrace what you truly are or remain safe in the cage of what others expect. The cage. That's what her marriage had become. A carefully constructed prison where her intellect withered and her spirit died by degrees. Richard's honeyed words still hung in the air, promising safety in submission, protection through obedience. The same lies that had kept her docile for 18 months while he slowly consumed everything she had been. Eleanor's fingers found the brass key her grandmother had pressed into her palm, still tucked in the hidden pocket of her dress where she'd kept it like a talisman. The metal was warm against her skin, as if it held some essence of the fierce old woman who had refused to bow to anyone's expectations. Slowly, deliberately, Eleanor crawled forward from beneath the table. "There's my sensible girl," Richard purred as she emerged into the candlelight, his voice dripping false relief. "Come to me now, and we'll—" "No." The word fell from Eleanor's lips like a stone into still water, creating ripples that seemed to expand through the very air itself. She pushed herself to her feet, swaying slightly but standing firm. "No, I will not come to you. I will never come to you again." Richard's expression shifted, his mask of concern cracking to reveal something predatory beneath. "Eleanor, darling, you're clearly overwrought. This stranger has filled your head with fantasies." "The only fantasy," Eleanor said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice, "was believing you were human." She turned to face Lucian, her heart hammering but her decision crystallizing with each word. "Tell me what you need from me." Lucian's ancient eyes searched her face, and she saw something like admiration flicker in their depths. "Are you certain? Once you cross this threshold, there will be no returning to your old life." Eleanor laughed, a sound edged with hysteria but underlaid with genuine mirth. "What old life? The one where I apologized for breathing too loudly, where I hid my books like shameful secrets?" She gestured toward Richard, whose human facade was rapidly deteriorating, "where I polished the boots of a monster who planned to devour me piece by piece." "Eleanor," Richard's voice had lost its silken quality, becoming something that scraped against her ears like broken glass. "You have no idea what you're choosing. He's not offering salvation, he's trading one form of imprisonment for another. Vampires don't protect, they possess." But Eleanor was already moving toward Lucian, each step carrying her further from the terrified woman who had cowered beneath furniture. The brass key in her pocket seemed to pulse with warmth, and she remembered her grandmother's stories about women who stood at crossroads between worlds, who chose dangerous truths over comfortable lies. "My grandmother prepared me for this," she said, understanding flooding through her like cold water. "All those languages she insisted I learn. They weren't just for cataloging manuscripts, were they? The research skills, the ability to see patterns others miss. It was all preparation." Lucian nodded slowly. "Your bloodline carries gifts that strengthen with each generation. Your grandmother was formidable, but you—" He paused, studying her with those midnight eyes. "You have the potential to be extraordinary." Behind them, Richard snarled, an inhuman sound that raised every primitive instinct Eleanor possessed. Potential means nothing without the will to use it. She spent a year learning to submit, to doubt herself. Watch her crumble the moment real choices demand real courage. Eleanor felt the familiar wave of self-doubt crash over her, Richard's words finding every carefully cultivated weakness in her psyche. For 18 months he had taught her that her judgment was flawed, her independence dangerous, her ambitions foolish. The frightened scholar in her whispered that he was right, that she was too small, too ordinary, too broken for whatever destiny awaited. But then she thought of every manuscript she had preserved, every translation that had unlocked lost knowledge, every quiet hour spent building bridges between past and present. Her work had mattered, even if Richard had convinced her otherwise. Her mind was a weapon he had tried to blunt but failed to destroy. "I choose the unknown," Eleanor said, her voice gaining strength with each syllable. "I choose danger over safety, truth over comfort. I choose to be more than the frightened woman you tried to create." She reached out and took Lucian's pale hand, feeling the chill of his skin against her palm. The moment their fingers touched, power sparked between them, ancient, electric, and utterly transformative. Eleanor gasped as knowledge flooded her mind, glimpses of supernatural courts and century-old conflicts, of her grandmother's secret correspondence, and the true reason for her family's long exile from Ravenscroft Manor. The threshold had been crossed. There would be no going back. The visions crashed through Eleanor's consciousness like a dam bursting, centuries of hidden history flooding her mind in an overwhelming torrent. She saw her grandmother as a young woman, standing in this very dining room while negotiating with figures who moved like living shadows. She witnessed battles fought in London's fog-shrouded streets between creatures that should have existed only in nightmares. Most startling of all, she glimpsed herself, or someone who bore her exact features, in scene after scene spanning generations, as if the same soul had been reborn again and again to stand at crucial moments in an eternal war. "What is happening to me?" Eleanor gasped, swaying on her feet as the supernatural knowledge settled into her mind like sediment in disturbed water. "The awakening," Lucian said softly, his cold hand steadying her. "Your bloodline carries memories in the very marrow. Each generation, one woman inherits not just the power, but the accumulated wisdom of all who came before." Richard's laugh was jagged as breaking glass. "Accumulated wisdom? Your precious bloodline has failed spectacularly for 3 centuries. Every chosen one either died screaming or fled into madness. What makes you think this broken little mouse will fare any better?" But Eleanor barely heard his taunts. The visions were organizing themselves, her scholarly mind automatically cataloguing and cross-referencing the supernatural archive now accessible to her. She understood with crystalline clarity that the creatures hunting her family weren't simple predators. They were servants of something far older and hungrier, something that fed on specific bloodlines to maintain its grip on the mortal world. "The Devourer," she whispered, the name rising from ancestral memory. "It's real. The entity my grandmother wrote about in her letters to the Historical Society. I thought they were metaphorical references to historical plagues." "Very real," Lucian confirmed grimly. "And growing stronger. Each generation it consumes provides more power, more knowledge of how to hunt the next. Your husband has been its instrument for longer than you can imagine." Eleanor turned to stare at Richard, seeing him clearly for the first time. The handsome face she'd once loved was merely a shell, she realized, a carefully crafted disguise worn by something that had hunted her bloodline for decades. How many women had he courted, married, and slowly consumed? How many Eleanor Blackthorns had trusted him before learning the truth too late? 6, Richard said, reading her expression with predatory amusement. "You're the 7th. Though I must admit, you've provided the most entertaining challenge." The others broke much more quickly. A surge of rage swept through Eleanor, not the helpless fury of an abused wife, but something far older and more powerful. The brass key in her pocket grew warm, almost hot, and she understood that it was more than a simple inheritance from her grandmother. It was a focal point, a way to channel the power that had always run in her blood but lay dormant until awakened by necessity. "The other women," Eleanor said, her voice carrying newfound authority that surprised even her. "You made them believe they were weak, worthless, but they weren't, were they? They were powerful enough that your master needed to destroy them personally rather than simply killing them outright." For the first time since revealing his true nature, Richard looked uncertain. Clever girl. But intelligence without strength is merely a slower path to the same end. "Then it's fortunate," said a new voice from the doorway, "that she won't be facing this alone." Eleanor spun toward the entrance to see 3 figures materializing from the shadows, 2 women and a man, all bearing the same otherworldly elegance that marked Lucian as something beyond mortal. The woman in front had silver hair that moved like liquid mercury, and eyes the color of winter storms. Her companions flanked her with the fluid precision of experienced warriors. "Seraphina," Lucian said, relief evident in his voice. "You received my message. Did you truly think we would abandon a Blackthorn awakening to chance?" Seraphina's gaze fixed on Eleanor, and she felt assessed by something ancient and implacably powerful, especially when the enemy has grown bold enough to reveal himself so completely. Richard's human mask had completely deteriorated now, revealing features that shifted and blurred like smoke given temporary form. "A vampire court," he hissed. "How delightfully theatrical. But you're too late. I've had 18 months to weave my influence through her mind. She may access her bloodline's memories, but she lacks the will to use them." Eleanor felt the familiar crushing weight of his psychological manipulation pressing down on her, the carefully conditioned responses that urged her to apologize, to submit, to make herself smaller. But now she recognized those feelings for what they were, external poison rather than internal truth. The warmth from her grandmother's key spread through her body like liquid courage, and she straightened to her full height. "You're wrong," Eleanor said quietly. "I spent 18 months letting you convince me I was weak. But I was never weak. I was just untrained." She looked around the circle of supernatural allies, feeling destiny clicking into place like tumblers in a lock. "Teach me." The ancient dining room of Ravenscroft Manor seemed to hold its breath as Eleanor's words hung in the air. The vampire court exchanged glances that spoke of centuries of shared understanding, while Richard's smoke-wreathed form writhed with barely contained fury. "Teaching requires time we don't have," Seraphina said, her mercury-bright hair catching the candlelight as she moved with predatory grace. "The Devourer's influence grows stronger each moment Richard remains in contact with you. Already I can feel its hunger pressing against the manor's protections." Eleanor's newfound awareness picked up what the vampire meant, a subtle wrongness in the air itself, as if reality was being slowly digested around Richard's presence. The wallpaper nearest him had begun to fade and peel, and the ancient floorboards creaked with a sound like breaking bones. "Then we teach her as we fight," Lucian said, moving to Eleanor's side with fluid certainty. "Her bloodline learns through action better than instruction anyway. The knowledge is already there. It simply needs awakening through necessity." One of Seraphina's companions, a dark-haired man whose eyes held the depth of midnight oceans, stepped forward. "The ritual circle is prepared in the conservatory. If we can get her there—" "No." Richard's voice had become something that bypassed the ears entirely, vibrating through bone and sinew. "I won't allow you to complete what her grandmother began. The Devourer has waited 3 centuries for this bloodline to reach full power. I won't see that investment lost to vampire sentimentality." The creature that had been Eleanor's husband began to expand, his false human form dissolving into something vast and hungry. Shadows poured from him like black water, reaching toward Eleanor with grasping tendrils that whispered promises of endless sleep. But Eleanor found herself stepping forward rather than back, the brass key now burning against her palm with supernatural heat. The ancestral memories flooding her mind showed her what to do, not through conscious thought, but through instinct honed across generations of women who had faced similar moments of terrible choice. "Umbras retro," she commanded, the Latin flowing from her lips with authority that surprised everyone present, including herself. "By blood and binding, by oath and ancestry, I deny you purchase here." The reaching shadows recoiled as if struck by physical force, and Richard's expanding form wavered like smoke in a sudden wind. Eleanor felt power coursing through her, not the vampire's supernatural strength, but something uniquely human, yet enhanced by centuries of accumulated will. "Impossible," Richard hissed, his form solidifying back into something approximating human shape. "You've been mine for 18 months. I've tasted your despair, fed on your self-doubt. You cannot simply will yourself free of my influence." "She's not willing herself free," Seraphina observed with something like admiration. "She's remembering what she was before you touched her. The conditioning was never as complete as you believed. Her grandmother's training ran deeper than your manipulation." Eleanor felt the truth of those words settling into her bones. Every late-night conversation with her grandmother about standing up for herself, every insistence that she learn languages her academic career didn't require, every story about women who chose dangerous truths over comfortable lies. It had all been preparation for this moment. But preparation and execution were different things entirely. Even with ancestral memories flooding her consciousness and supernatural allies at her side, Eleanor could feel the vast malevolence pressing against the manor's protections. Richard was merely the Devourer's instrument. The true enemy was something far older and hungrier than any single predator. "The conservatory," she said, understanding crystallizing with scholarly precision. "There's a focal point there. Something my grandmother prepared in case this day came." Lucian nodded grimly. A binding circle drawn with your family's blood, charged with 3 centuries of protective spells. If we can reach it. If you can reach it, you mean, Eleanor corrected, her newfound awareness showing her the shape of what must come. This was always meant to be faced alone. The bloodline's burden, the bloodline's choice. Eleanor, no. Lucian's voice carried genuine anguish. Your grandmother didn't sacrifice everything just so you could throw your life away on noble gestures. We can face this together. But Eleanor was already moving, the brass key in her hand beginning to glow with inner fire. The ancestral memories showed her the path, through the manor's twisting corridors, past portraits of women who shared her face, toward a destiny that had been building for generations. Together, she agreed, looking back at the vampire court with something approaching affection. But not the way you mean. You'll have your part to play. But first, I need to remember who I really am. Richard lunged toward her with inhuman speed, shadows streaming from his form like living darkness. But Eleanor was already running, not in flight but in approach, racing toward whatever waited in the conservatory where her grandmother had prepared humanity's last gambit against an ancient hunger. Behind her, supernatural forces clashed in the dining room, where her nightmare had begun. Ahead lay either salvation or destruction. Eleanor Blackthorne ran toward her fate with her eyes wide open. The conservatory doors burst open before Eleanor's desperate sprint, shattering inward as if the manor itself recognized the urgency of her approach. Moonlight streamed through the glass ceiling, illuminating a space transformed beyond recognition. What had once been her grandmother's sanctuary of exotic plants was now a cathedral of supernatural preparation. At the room's heart lay a perfect circle carved into the stone floor, its channels filled with what looked like liquid starlight, but which Eleanor's awakened senses recognized as something far more precious, 3 centuries of Blackthorn blood, freely given by women who had known this moment would come. Around the circle's perimeter stood 13 obsidian pillars, each topped with artifacts that hummed with barely contained power. But it was the figure waiting at the circle's center that stopped Eleanor's breath entirely. Her grandmother stood there, not as Eleanor remembered her from their final meeting, aged and frail, but as she had been in her prime, tall, regal, with Eleanor's own dark hair flowing loose and eyes that held depths of knowledge that could drown civilizations. She was translucent, more memory than ghost, but undeniably present. "Grandmother?" Eleanor whispered, her voice breaking on the word. "Dearest child." Victoria Blackthorne's voice carried the weight of eternity. "I have been waiting so long for you to come home." Behind Eleanor, the manor shuddered as supernatural forces collided in its depths. Richard's inhuman roar echoed through the corridors, accompanied by sounds of splintering wood and shattering stone. Whatever battle raged between him and the vampire court was destroying her sanctuary piece by piece. "The circle," her grandmother said urgently. "You must complete what I began. The binding will hold him, but only if freely chosen by one who shares his blood bond." Eleanor's steps faltered at the circle's edge. "His blood bond? I don't understand." "The wedding ritual," Victoria explained, her form flickering as the manor's protections wavered. "When he fed you his essence disguised as wine during your marriage ceremony, it created a connection that let him poison your thoughts, but it also made you the only one who can sever his tie to this realm." The brass key in Eleanor's palm flared with sudden heat, and she understood with terrifying clarity what was being asked of her. To enter the circle meant accepting not just her family's power, but its ultimate sacrifice. Every Blackthorn woman for 3 centuries had poured her life force into this moment, building toward a binding that could banish the Devourer's influence forever. But it would require her death to activate. No. The voice came from the shattered doorway, where Lucian stood bleeding from a dozen wounds, his elegant coat torn and his ancient eyes blazing with desperate fury. "There has to be another way. Your grandmother's journal spoke of binding, not obliteration." Victoria's translucent form turned toward the vampire with something like pity. "The binding was always meant to be my death-working child of darkness. I prepared Eleanor not to repeat my sacrifice, but to choose differently, to live where I could not. Eleanor felt the weight of generations pressing down on her, each ancestral memory crying out for justice, for an end to the hunting that had claimed so many of her blood. The circle pulsed with accumulated power, ready to receive whatever she was willing to give. But as she raised her foot to cross the threshold, Richard's shadows came pouring through the conservatory walls like a living tide. The creature that had been her husband materialized from the darkness, no longer bothering with human form. He was hunger given shape, emptiness dressed in teeth and claws and ancient malevolence. Did you think your dead grandmother's parlor tricks could stop what has fed for millennia? His voice came from everywhere and nowhere, bypassing sound to speak directly to her terror. The circle will only amplify my power once I consume you within it. Eleanor's courage wavered as the familiar weight of his psychological dominance crashed over her. For 18 months, this thing had taught her to doubt every instinct, question every decision, apologize for taking up space in the world. Even with supernatural power coursing through her veins and ancestral memories flooding her consciousness, she felt herself becoming small again, the frightened woman who had hidden beneath furniture while her world collapsed. "That's right," Richard whispered, his shadows reaching toward her with caressing hunger. "Remember what you really are. Not a hero from your grandmother's stories. Just a broken librarian who couldn't even leave an abusive marriage without supernatural intervention." The brass key grew cold in her palm as self-doubt poisoned her newfound strength. Eleanor looked at the binding circle, at her grandmother's expectant spirit, at Lucian's desperate plea for her to choose life over sacrifice. Too many choices, too much responsibility, too much chance of choosing wrongly and dooming everyone who had trusted her. She closed her eyes and made the only choice that felt true. Eleanor Blackthorne stepped into the circle. Power exploded through her like lightning-seeking ground, 3 centuries of accumulated will and sacrifice flowing into her mortal frame. Her grandmother's spirit smiled once, proud and fierce and finally at peace, before dissolving into pure energy that joined the maelstrom building around Eleanor's transformed consciousness. The ordeal had begun. The moment Eleanor's feet touched the binding circle's starlit channels, she knew she had made a catastrophic mistake. Power beyond mortal comprehension flooded through her nervous system like molten silver, but instead of the controlled awakening her grandmother's memories had promised, she felt herself being torn apart from within. 3 centuries of accumulated Blackthorne will crashed into her consciousness all at once, not the gentle guidance of ancestral wisdom, but a screaming torrent of every fear, every sacrifice, every moment of desperation that had led to this circle's creation. She was Victoria Blackthorne, dying alone in this very conservatory as the Devourer's first servant closed in for the kill. She was Margaret Blackthorne, watching her children burn in what history would call an unfortunate house fire. She was dozens of women whose names she couldn't separate from her own thoughts, each life ending in failure as the entity they fought grew stronger. "Eleanor!" Lucian's voice reached her through the supernatural maelstrom, but when she tried to respond, blood poured from her mouth instead of words. Her mortal frame was never meant to channel this much accumulated power. The circle hadn't been designed for binding, it had been built as a reservoir, storing generations of life force for a final desperate gambit that would consume everything her family had ever been. But she understood too late that her grandmother's plan had been fundamentally flawed. "You feel it now, don't you?" Richard's voice came from everywhere at once as his shadow form began seeping into the circle itself, drawn by the power radiating from Eleanor's transforming body. The weight of all their failures. Every Blackthorne woman who thought she could be the one to end this cycle, only to feed my master's hunger instead. Through the agony of her dissolving sense of self, Eleanor watched in horror as Richard's essence began merging with the circle's accumulated energy. The binding her grandmother had spent 3 centuries preparing wasn't containing him. It was offering him the distilled life force of Eleanor's entire bloodline as a feast. "The blood bond," she gasped, finally understanding the trap that had been laid not for Richard, but for her. The marriage ritual hadn't just given him access to her thoughts, it had marked her as a key that would unlock the Blackthorn, family's accumulated power, and deliver it directly to the devourer. Lucian lunged toward the circle but struck an invisible barrier that sent him reeling backward, his vampiric strength useless against protections that had been woven with specifically human magic. She could see the anguish in his ancient eyes as he realized the same truth that was dawning on her. There was no way to reverse what she had set in motion. Every marriage, every courtship, every woman who thought she was escaping an abusive husband, Richard continued, his shadows wrapping around Eleanor's convulsing form like loving caresses. All of it planned, all of it guided toward this moment. Did you think it was chance that brought you to this manor? Coincidence that you inherited it at precisely the moment you most needed refuge? Eleanor's photographic memory, enhanced now to supernatural clarity, began replaying every moment of her relationship with Richard with new understanding. The way he had appeared in the library, just when she was researching her family's history. How he had encouraged her scholarly work on the very folklore that would eventually lead her to these secrets. The calculated precision with which he had isolated her from friends, family, anyone who might have recognized the patterns. She hadn't escaped her abusive marriage. She had completed it. The other women, she managed to whisper through lips that were beginning to crack like old parchment. My grandmother, the others who built this circle. Oh, they genuinely tried to fight, Richard said with something approaching fondness. Each one thought she had found the way to break the cycle. But they were never trying to bind me, dear Eleanor. They were preparing you. Every spell they wove, every protection they carved, every drop of blood they spilled, it all served to create the perfect vessel for my master's ascension. The conservatory's glass ceiling began to fracture as power beyond its containment pressed against the manor's foundations. Eleanor felt her grandmother's spirit, not the proud, protective presence she had believed, but something hollow and manipulated. A ghost dancing to the devourer's ancient choreography. Through her failing vision, she saw Lucian and the vampire court fighting desperately against barriers they couldn't cross, their supernatural abilities useless against magic that had been specifically designed to exclude them from the circle's final working. They had been permitted to help her reach this point, she realized, encouraged even because their protection had made her confident enough to make the choice that doomed her. The brass key in her palm crumbled to dust as her body began to follow the same path, centuries of stored life force flowing through her into something vast and hungry that pressed against the boundaries of the physical world. She had thought she was choosing sacrifice to save others. Instead, she had chosen to feed the very darkness she had hoped to destroy. As consciousness faded, Eleanor's last coherent thought was a prayer that her death might at least be quick enough to deny the devourer the satisfaction of her despair. Even that mercy was denied her.